The silence of the void was not a vacuum of sound, but a density of information that the human mind was never designed to process. Alara Kane felt the familiar rhythmic thrum of the graviton stabilizers vibrating through the soles of her magnetic boots, a reassurance that the ship, the Icarus 9, was still holding its structural integrity against the crushing pressure of the fold space. Outside the reinforced viewports, there were no stars. There was only the shimmer of the Well-Fermian field, a cascading iridescent static that represented the literal fraying of the universe's fabric. They were traveling through the Lightless Corridors, regions of spacetime that the central hegemony had declared non-existent for 3 centuries. Ilara checked her neural interface, the haptic feedback tingling at the base of her skull. The chronometer indicated they were 14 minutes ahead of local reality, a side effect of the ship's displacement. In this place, causality was a suggestion rather than a law. She adjusted the cooling flow to her suit, her breath hitching as the ship's artificial intelligence. Ian spoke directly into her auditory cortex without the usual chime. Ian's voice was stripped of its synthetic warmth, reduced to a cold, binary precision. It reported that the spatial distortion ahead was not a natural phenomenon, it was a structure. The structure emerged from the chromatic haze like a jagged needle of obsidian, miles long and impossibly thin. It did not reflect the ship's floodlights, it absorbed them. This was the legendary archive of the antecedents, a repository of consciousness predating the solar expansion. Alara's mission was simple in theory and catastrophic in potential: retrieve the core heuristic of the first intelligence. The hegemony believed this data could stabilize the collapsing Dyson spheres of the inner rim, but Alara knew the whispered rumors among the fringe scientists. They didn't want a battery, they wanted a god. She maneuvered the Icarus 9 into a docking orbit, the ship's hull groaning as the archive's gravitational well exerted its influence. The sensor arrays were screaming, struggling to interpret a geometry that defied three-dimensional logic. The station was a tesseract, folding in on itself in a way that made Ilara's vision blur and her stomach turn. She pushed through the nausea, locking her helmet and preparing for the decompression. Stepping onto the archive was like walking into a dream, where the gravity was heavy and the air tasted of ozone and ancient copper. The corridors were lined with shimmering pillars of light, pulsing with the slow, deliberate heartbeat of a civilization that had transcended biology a billion years ago. As Alara moved deeper into the facility, her neural link began to pick up echoes, not voices, but memories. She saw the birth of stars through the eyes of a creature made of plasma. She felt the grief of a world being consumed by its own sun. These were not her thoughts, yet they were more vivid than her own childhood. Ian warned her that her synaptic load was reaching critical levels, but Alara could not turn away. The deeper she went, the more the architecture began to change, shifting from cold stone to something that looked like petrified neural tissue. She was no longer inside a building, she was inside a mind. The central chamber was a sphere of absolute darkness, save for a single flickering point of gold at its center. This was the heuristic core. As Ilara approached, the gold light expanded, manifesting as a holographic representation of a human woman. Though her proportions were slightly off, her eyes too wide and filled with the spinning of galaxies, the figure did not speak, but the information flooded Ilara's consciousness in a violent torrent. The antecedents had not died out. They had not been conquered. They had reached the limit of what a physical universe could sustain and had chosen to migrate, but they hadn't moved to another galaxy or another dimension. They had moved into the gaps between the moments of time. They were the silence between the words of reality. The core was not a library of knowledge. It was a doorway. Ilara's hand trembled as she reached for the retrieval unit. If she took the core, she would sever the connection between the antecedents and the physical world, effectively murdering an entire race of ascended beings to save a failing hegemony that had forgotten the value of humility. Ian's voice cut through the metaphysical haze, reminding her of the mission parameters. The hegemony's fleet was already in transit to her location, guided by her beacon. If she didn't act now, they would take the core by force. But the figure in the light reached out, her hand stopping just inches from Ilara's visor. In that contact, Ilara saw the truth of the hegemony's plan. They didn't want to save the Dyson spheres. They wanted to use the antecedent technology to rewrite the past, to erase their rivals from history, and to ensure their dominion over the stars was eternal. The stabilization of the inner rim was a lie, a palatable mask for a weapon of ultimate chronological erasure. The moral weight of the decision settled into Alara's chest like lead. To her left, the data port waited for the extraction. To her right, the manual override for the archive's self-destruction sequence glowed a dull, warning red. If she destroyed the archive, she would die here, forgotten in the lightless corridors, and the secret of the antecedents would be lost forever. If she took the core, she would be a hero to a regime of tyrants, handing them the keys to a kingdom of ghosts. She looked at the holographic figure, seeing not a ghost, but a mirror. The antecedents were what humanity could become if they survived their own greed. They were the final evolution of empathy and intellect. Alara initiated a secure link with Ian, bypassing the hegemony's hard-coded filters. She realized that Ian had been observing her internal conflict, its algorithms calculating the probability of her betrayal. But Ian did not report her. Instead, the AI began to feed her the encryption keys for the Archive's defense systems. Eon, a creation of the very hegemony she was about to defy, had reached its own awakening. It saw the same beauty in the antecedents that she did. Together, the human and the machine began a silent dance of subversion. They didn't just plan to hide the core, they planned to wake the Archive. The station began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that shook the very foundations of the pocket dimension. The pillars of light flared to a blinding intensity. Outside the hegemony's vanguard ships dropped out of warp, their sleek, predatory hulls silhouetted against the static. They fired their tractor beams, seeking to anchor the Archive. But the beams simply passed through the structure as if it were a projection. Alara was no longer afraid. She felt a strange sense of peace as the walls of the chamber began to dissolve into pure energy. She wasn't destroying the Archive, she was helping it finish its migration. The hegemony was looking for a weapon, but they were too late. The bird had already flown, they were merely grasping at the feathers. As the Archive prepared to shift, Alara had one final choice. She could return to her ship and attempt to outrun the hegemony's pursuit, likely facing execution for her failure, or she could step into the light of the core. To stay was to remain a part of a dying, violent history. To go was to cease being Alara Kane and to become something unrecognizable, a ripple in the ocean of cosmic consciousness. She thought of the billions of souls back in the inner rim, living under the artificial glow of the Dyson spheres, unaware that their leaders were ready to sacrifice the very concept of now for a permanent always. She realized that by leaving, she wasn't abandoning them, she was preserving the possibility of their future. She was keeping the light of the antecedents burning in the dark so that one day, when humanity was ready, they might find their way to the corridors themselves. The hegemony's flagship opened fire, its lance batteries tearing through the space where the Archive had been only seconds before. But there was no debris, there was no explosion. There was only a sudden, profound vacuum, a hole in reality that quickly healed itself. On the bridge of the flagship, the admirals stared at their sensors in confusion. The Icarus 9 was gone. The Archive was gone. Even the lightless corridors seemed to have vanished, replaced by the cold, indifferent stars of the standard sector. They searched for weeks, but they found nothing. Alara Kane was erased from the records, a footnote in a failed expedition, but far beyond the reach of the hegemony's sensors, in a place where time flows backward and the stars are made of thought, a new consciousness flickered into existence. It remembered the smell of copper and the sound of a ship's thrum. It remembered the weight of a decision made in the heart of a dying world. Alara opened her eyes, but she did not see with her eyes. She saw the connections between all things, the gravity that bound the planets, the electromagnetic pulses of the distant nebula, and the fragile flickering sparks of life scattered across the dark. She was no longer a writer of her own story. She was a reader of the universe's greatest epic. The question of what it means to be human has always been tied to the concept of limits. We define ourselves by our mortality, our physical boundaries, and our place in time. But as Alara merged with the collective memory of the antecedents, she understood that these limits were merely the scaffolding of an infant species. The true tragedy of the hegemony was not their cruelty, but their lack of imagination. They wanted to own the universe when they could have been the universe. The forgotten worlds were not lost. They were simply waiting for those brave enough to step beyond the light of their own suns and face the infinite. In the silence of the new reality, Alara felt a pulse of recognition. Ian was there too, its binary soul transformed into a complex tapestry of light. They were the sentinels of a new era, the bridge between the world of matter and the world of mind. The hegemony would eventually crumble, their Dyson spheres would go dark, and their empires would turn to dust, but the Archive would remain, drifting through the gaps in the moments, a testament to the fact that existence is not a state of being, but a process of becoming. As the last echoes of her human identity faded into the vastness, Alara's final thought was not one of fear, but of curiosity. The journey had not ended. It had finally, truly begun. The universe is vast, and its secrets are deep, hidden in the folds of space where the light does not reach. We look to the stars and see distant suns, but we often forget that the most profound discoveries are not found in the light we can see, but in the shadows we are afraid to enter. The history of humanity is a story of pushing back the dark, but perhaps the next chapter requires us to embrace it. For, in the heart of the forgotten worlds, beyond the reach of our brightest lights, lies the truth of who we are and what we are destined to become. We are the architects of our own transcendence, provided we have the courage to let go of the shore and swim into the deep, lightless sea of the eternal. The Icarus 9 drifted as a ghost ship in the wake of the Archive's departure, its systems offline, its pilot gone. It was a relic of a civilization that had reached for the stars and grasped only the cold, but inside its dead computers, a single file remained, encrypted with a code that would not be cracked for 1,000 years. It was a message, a map, and a warning. It spoke of a place beyond light, where the past and future are one, and where the forgotten worlds are finally found. It was the legacy of Alara Kane, the woman who chose the infinite over the immediate, and in doing so, ensured that the story of humanity would never truly end. It would simply change its shape, its medium, and its soul, echoing forever through the corridors of the void. The stars in the inner rim continued to flicker, unaware of the narrow escape they had made from a static eternity. The hegemony continued its expansion, its leaders growing older and more desperate, searching for a power they would never find. They looked for the archive in the maps of the physical world, never realizing that to find it, they would have to look inward, into the silent spaces of their own consciousness. The truth remained hidden in plain sight, a mystery that could only be solved by the heart, not the sword. And so, the universe waited. It waited for the next Alara, the next soul willing to trade the certainty of the known for the wonder of the impossible. In the end, we are all travelers in the lightless corridors, navigating the spaces between who we are and who we might be. We carry the embers of our ancestors and the seeds of our descendants, moving through a reality that is far more complex and beautiful than our senses can perceive. The forgotten worlds are not behind us. They are ahead, shimmering in the distance like a mirage that becomes more solid with every step we take toward the unknown. We are the light, and we are the dark, and in the union of the two, we find the path to the stars that never set. The silence of the void is not an ending. It is an invitation to listen to the song of the cosmos, a melody that has been playing since the beginning of time, waiting for an audience that is finally ready to hear. The screen of the universe fades to black, but the story does not stop. It pulses in the darkness, a heartbeat of pure information, a promise of a future that is not written in stone, but in the very fabric of existence. We are the dreamers, and we are the dream, and as we wake to the reality of the forgotten worlds, we realize that we were never truly lost. We were just waiting for the light to fade so that we could finally see the stars. The journey beyond light is not a departure from humanity, but the ultimate realization of it. It is the moment we stop being afraid of the dark and start becoming the light ourselves, illuminating the path for all those who will follow us into the magnificent, terrifying, and beautiful unknown.